Welcome back, everybody, to part two of the Constitution. Today, we will be discussing Amendment 1 and further expanding upon where we left off after speech. Today, folks, we're going to talk about freedom of the press, and it states Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press. The press is very much just like speech, except it's done on more of a mass scale of communication. What is press? Press can be your newspaper, it can be a magazine, it can be your internet or your social media sites that you kids know all about. Billboards, flyers, brochures. It can be your clothing, it can be the television, it can be a book, it can be a leaflet, it can be anything again that is mass communicated. It can even be a bumper sticker. Freedom of the press, things you can and cannot do. You can print any political position you believe in. Now, I cannot. I'm a teacher. Therefore, I'm not allowed to do that in school. What if I did it on Facebook or Twitter or some other form of medium such as that? It can actually come back and get a teacher in trouble for doing that. There have been instances where people have been fired based on printing something on their social media politically that has gotten them in trouble, or they've gone someplace believing that they can post about something which could be racist in a meme, or they can share a video, and that's not necessarily freedom. Because if it goes against your company's policy or it violates and goes back to that word I used before with First Amendment speech, infringes on someone, then you can be held accountable. You are allowed to make fun of people, especially politicians. This is known as parody law, and as long as there's a disclaimer relating as such, then of course it's legal. I tell the story in my AP history class that there was a man named Boss Tweed who was the head of Tammany Hall, and he was a corrupt politician. And so the newspapers, of course, would publish political cartoons, and they depicted him as a fat man with money flowing out of his pockets, and he was eventually imprisoned for his corruption and thievery. But one of the cartoons, he had escaped. One of the cartoons showed him with wings breaking out of a jail. During this time in the 1880s, you had so many immigrants that couldn't read or speak English, but they could view these cartoons, and then, of course, they could relate their own story. Well, as the story goes, one of these immigrants spotted Boss Tweed based on this cartoon character, and that one parody that was published in the newspaper actually led to his capture. Uh, but you have to also watch, because when we talk about exposing wrongs by the government, we are a nation that puts things on our media first. And we react more than we act on anything. And a good case is, of course, all the violence that occurred in the summertime, even before George Floyd. But that highlighted the fact that everyone today, or almost everyone today, has the ability to have a cell phone with video capabilities, and they're out there capturing these images. Now, you have to remember there are times that that's legal and there are times that it's illegal. Doing so in school is illegal. If people don't know about it, it's illegal. Then why can schools have cameras? Well, because the schools tell you that the hallways are being monitored by cameras. Again, it's in plain sight. It's there. There's no hiding it. We're talking about people who tend to hide these things. Um, but we'll talk more about that as the year goes on. And you may say things you may not agree with. You can print things you may not agree with. Uh, we look at this whole um, year of 2020, in which three words come to mind: COVID, pandemic, and this is actually two words: fake news. That's right, fake news. What is published? What is real? What are we seeing that is real? How do we know if it's real? Do we back check? Do we fact check? Now, two of the things you're absolutely not allowed to do is you're not allowed to disclose defense security secrets. You cannot detail how to make certain weapons. In fact, it's very illegal for you to have blueprints or publish copies of blueprints of 3D guns or and how to make those guns. So again, our government allows you a lot of leeway when it comes to publishing things. Now, if you were to print something that is false or sets out to intentionally injure a person's reputation by what you print, as long as that what they're printing, of course, is false, that's known as libel, Libel. And libel is not that difficult to prove. Again, if you were to write something down, or if you were to post something and you didn't see it firsthand, well, that can get you in trouble. And um, your amendments are your rights. Those can't be taken away from you unless, of course, you violate someone else's rights. Now, two cases I want to talk about real quick before we move on. The first is Schenck versus the United States, and then the second, of course, would be Sacco and Vanzetti that you see here. In the case of Schenck versus the United States, Mr. Schenck was the head of one of the socialist communist parties in the United States, and he distributed leaflets back in 1917 against the draft. Well, the government had passed two laws, and those two laws were the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918. Basically, what these did was work hand in hand. One, you couldn't promote or say anything that would go against our government or the need to um, control things in wartime. So it made it illegal to cause, to incite insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty in the military or naval forces of the United States. And that included the draft that was going on for these kids going into World War One. So Schenck pushed out these leaflets, and basically the government ruled against Schenck and said that the Espionage Act was constitutional, free speech was not an absolute right, and civil liberties may be limited during wartime. In the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, which was a true travesty of court cases, which we'll learn about later, they're caught with communist socialist leaflets on their belonging after someone was murdered, and they found a gun on them. Unfortunately, the gun didn't match the bullet used or the caliber used. Government didn't care. The fact that they had these Communist Party papers on them meant that they had to be guilty of something, and so they were put to death for a murder that they clearly did not commit. And again, the government ruled that those writings that they had on them violated and went against the good of the company or Congress. We'll wrap up there for today, folks, but I want you to remember that freedom of press is very much like speech. There are limitations on what you can publish, you can write, and there's things that you'll be surprised when we do the court cases that you're going to be shocked that people can actually write, print, or publish things that go against the good of the nature, but they're allowed, but yet other things aren't. We'll talk more about how television shows like Family Guy get away or South Park get away with what they do based on the fact that it's a cartoon and therefore. Even though people would be like, oh, that's libel, that's libel. Yes, it is libel, except it's a parody, and therefore laws are dictated a little different than that. We'll also talk more in depth later about the television and how television is another form of press that, when put out there, it's not always truthful. And we know that based on you can flip between channels and see the different truths that come out based on those TV's programs. So, all right, we'll stop here. Have a great day. Come back tomorrow for the remainder of the First Amendment.